Last winter had been especially harsh. That year, the Montero family home, located in a small rural town surrounded by hills and open fields, seemed to have lost all the warmth and welcome it once had. Since their father's death, brothers Julio, aged 15, and his younger sister, Isabella, aged just 10, felt completely lost. His father, a hard-working and honest man, was the foundation of the family and the reason for all the security and joy they both knew. He left after a quick and relentless illness, and left them in the care of Lucrezia, his stepmother. The woman, who had never been close to her brothers, appeared cold and distant immediately after the funeral, making the pain of loss even more difficult to bear. As the weeks went by, Lucretia's attitude became increasingly cruel. She kept Julio and Isabella on exhausting tasks, from the first rays of the sun until dusk, without rest. In that house that was once the brothers' safe home, they began to feel like prisoners, hostages of a compassionless stepmother. The cold in the house didn't just come from the winter, but from Lucretia's indifference, who cared little about their well-being. At the slightest sign of tiredness, she would raise her voice and sometimes threaten her brothers, making it clear that she would not hesitate to make them even more miserable if they did not obey her orders. Julio, already quite mature for his age, tried to protect Isabella as much as possible. He took on the heavier tasks, doing his best to make sure his sister wasn't so burdened, but it was difficult. Isabella, although she was still a child, was aware of Lucretia's hostility and the responsibilities that her brother assumed for her. She harbored a constant fear that something worse could happen, but at the same time she tried not to let Julio notice her fear. They both knew that their father, if he were alive, would never allow them to be treated in such a cruel way, but now they felt alone and without protection. As the months went by, the situation in the house became unsustainable. The working conditions imposed by Lucretia worsened. She began denying them meals and often made them sleep in a secluded area of the barn that was cold and uncomfortable. In the solitude of the night, the brothers shared their pain and fears, and Julio, even trying to be strong, was already thinking about running away from that house, in the hope of finding a better destiny for himself and Isabella. One night, while they were talking quietly in the barn, Isabella confessed, "I'm afraid of staying here, Julio. What if she really hurts us?" This question kept echoing in his brother's mind, who knew they could no longer stay in that place. Then, one cold morning, Julio finally made the decision he had been putting off for so long. He waited for the house to be silent, for Lucretia to be sound asleep, and he woke Isabella with a light touch. "Let's go," he whispered, his heart racing. Without questioning, the girl got up and picked up her small bag, where she kept a few souvenirs of her father. With careful steps, the brothers walked out the back door and left everything they knew behind. The clothes they wore were sparse for the cold, and the food they got wouldn't last more than a few days. But at that moment, the only thing that mattered was escaping. They walked for hours without direction, just wanting to get as far away from that house as possible. The road seemed endless, and the darkness was broken only by the brightness of the stars and the light of the moon. Julio held Isabella's hand firmly, promising himself that he would take care of her, no matter what. He felt that every step he took that night was a step towards a more dignified life, away from Lucrezia's relentless control. No matter how uncertain the path ahead was, Julio believed that freedom, even with all the challenges it would bring, was the best choice. However, as the day lightened, the reality of their situation began to take its toll. They were exhausted, cold, and hungry. The two stopped on the side of a dirt road and settled down under a tree, trying to get some rest. Julio pulled out the small blanket they brought and wrapped it around Isabella, trying to keep her warm. He knew they would need a plan to survive outside of Lucretia's house, but at that moment, he was exhausted and without direction. "We'll make it, I say," he said, trying to comfort his sister, although he himself felt the weight of the unknown. They both closed their eyes for a moment, as the first light of morning bathed the sky in shades of orange and pink, marking the beginning of a new and uncertain phase of their lives. Dawn brought a mix of fear and hope. Julio knew that he would need to find some kind of help for them, and that they would depend on the kindness of strangers to stay safe and fed. Although the challenges were enormous, he felt that this was the beginning of something bigger, a new opportunity for both of them. The first night away from home was difficult, but the real challenge began at dawn. The brothers didn't know exactly where to go, but Julio had a vague idea that they needed to get to a bigger city, where they could go unnoticed and maybe find some kind of work. Winter was still punishing, and the cold wind of the early morning hours made them wake up shivering. Julio tried to warm Isabella with the little they had, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. The only solution was to move forward, walk until they found shelter and something to eat. Hunger was something new for the brothers, who until then had never experienced real need. Despite all Lucretia's cruelty, there had always been some food in the house. Now, however, without resources and with only a few fruits and pieces of bread that they took with them when they left, they felt the emptiness in their stomachs growing with each passing hour. Julio, trying to be strong for his sister, tried to distract her by telling stories about his father and how he used to say that it was necessary to be stronger than difficulties. Although he himself was fearful, those words from his father gave him strength, and he saw that, little by little, they calmed Isabella too. As they walked, they passed small villages and farms. The locals, however, didn't seem very willing to help. Many looked away, perhaps out of distrust or perhaps because poverty also affected them. When they finally saw a small town in the distance, they felt temporary relief, as if the sight represented a chance to get some kind of help. The town, however, was modest, with few houses and limited commerce, and they soon realized that it would be difficult to find anyone who would offer shelter or food without question. As they entered the city, Julio saw a small market and, hesitantly, decided to order a piece of bread. The baker, a burly man with a stern expression, looked suspiciously at the brothers before asking what they were doing alone. Julio tried to remain calm and replied that they were looking for work, that they had lost their father and needed help to survive. The baker sighed, looking around, as if he didn't want anyone else to see them. He then took a loaf of bread, broke it in two and gave half to each of them, but made it clear that he could do no more for them. "Here, keep this, but then go on your way. I can't take care of you." The brothers thanked them, ate the bread quickly and walked away. The food brought some relief, but it also reinforced how precarious the situation was. Julius knew they couldn't depend solely on the kindness of strangers for long. They would need to find a way to support themselves, but how they would do that, he didn't yet know. They sat in a square, trying to decide their next steps. Isabella, watching the local children play, seemed for a moment to forget her problems, but the sight of other people's joy only increased Julio's feeling of helplessness. It was then that an elderly man, watching them from afar, approached. He looked tired, but there was a certain kindness in his eyes. He asked what two young people were doing alone in such a small town and, reluctantly, Julio told the truth about his escape and his cruel stepmother. The old man listened attentively, without interrupting, and at the end he gave a slight smile of understanding. "You have courage," he said, "but courage alone is not enough. You must have a plan and a destiny." He offered advice, to head towards a larger city, where they would have a better chance of finding shelter and temporary work. With the mental map that the old man drew for them, Julio felt that they at least had a direction. He and Isabella walked for a few more kilometers before stopping to rest on the side of a road. They were exhausted, but now they had a new destiny. The city the old man had mentioned was about 2 days' walk away, and although the journey was long and dangerous, Julio felt that, for the first time, they had a chance to start over. Isabella, although still tired and scared, trusted her brother and maintained the optimistic smile that always accompanied her. In that moment, as they watched the road in front of them, Julio promised himself that, no matter what happened, he would find a way to take care of his sister. The old man's words about courage and destiny echoed in his mind, and he knew he would need to find more than just physical strength to overcome what was coming. The journey would be long, but he felt that, with Isabella by his side, they would be able to face any challenge that came their way. The first day of walking towards the bigger city was exhausting. The light clothes they wore were not enough for the biting cold, and the little food they got did not last long. With no one to turn to and no money, the brothers continued in resigned silence, only stopping to rest when their fatigue was unbearable. Julio knew they couldn't go on like this for long, but he tried to stay focused, encouraging Isabella not to give up. "We'll get there soon, I say," he said, trying to hide his own uncertainty. "And when we arrive, we will find a better life." On the road, they met few travelers, and many of those who crossed the brothers' path looked at them strangely, without offering any kind of help. It was as if they were invisible, and this began to weigh on Julio's heart, as he felt responsible for everything. He couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. He believed that, if he had been smarter, perhaps he would have found a way to escape from Lucretia without exposing Isabella to so much suffering. But whenever he looked at her and saw her determined face, he felt comforted. Isabella was stronger than she appeared, and her presence gave her the strength to continue. On the second day, hunger and exhaustion reached a critical point. The brothers were weak, and the cold seemed worse with every step they took. Isabella tripped over a rock and fell, scraping her knee. The small injury, although not serious, took away the girl's strength and, for the first time, she began to cry. Julio hugged her, feeling helpless. He wanted to promise her that everything would be okay, that they would soon have food and shelter, but the reality was harsh, and he didn't know if he would have the strength to continue. "I'm sorry, I say," he whispered, with tears in his eyes. "I wish I could do more for you." As they recovered from Isabella's fall, a small group of people passed by them. Among them, a lady noticed the brothers and stopped to observe them closely. She realized the difficult situation they found themselves in, and, when she saw Isabella's sad eyes, her heart felt sorry. "Do you need help, children?" he asked, his voice gentle but cautious. Julio hesitated, but the lady's kind look made him trust her. He explained that they were going to the big city, in search of a better life. The woman, without asking many questions, offered them some food and a blanket, and advised them to rest before continuing their journey. The unexpected kindness of that lady was a relief to the brothers, who ate gratefully and warmed themselves under the blanket. She also gave them some valuable advice. "Remember, no matter how hard things get, you have each other. And that is the most important thing." Her words brought new encouragement to Julio, who began to realize that, despite all the difficulties, the union he and Isabella had was his greatest strength. The lady said goodbye, wishing them good luck and praying that they would find a better fate. When they resumed their walk, the brothers felt renewed, as if the kindness they received had strengthened their spirits. Isabella, with her knee less painful, smiled again, and that gave Julio new determination. He knew they still had a long way to go, but the memory that they had found someone willing to help comforted them. It was as if that lady's presence was a sign that, in the world, there was still kindness, and that they could find their place if they had patience and courage. At dusk, the brothers found a sheltered place next to a group of trees and, for the first time since leaving, they were able to sleep relatively peacefully. Julio felt that they were approaching their destination, and this gave him hope. He promised Isabella that when they arrived in the city, they would find work and be able to start a new life. While his sister fell asleep, he stayed awake for a while, watching the starry sky and reflecting on everything they had been through. "We're almost there," he thought, feeling that, finally, a new beginning was within his reach. After days of walking and exhaustion, the brothers finally reached the outskirts of the big city. It was the first time they had seen tall buildings and busy avenues, a sight so different from anything they knew. Julio and Isabella, although admired, also felt a certain fear. They knew that, amid so many people and the chaos of the city, they would need to find a safe corner to start over. The idea of getting lost or being ignored among so many strangers scared them, but the need to survive was greater, and Julio remained determined. As soon as they arrived, they looked for a park where they could rest and make a plan. The streets were busy, and they felt small in the face of the immensity around them. After a brief walk through the park, Julio saw an isolated bench and decided that it would be a good place to sit and rest. He knew they needed to mentally prepare themselves to face the next steps. But when he looked at Isabella's tired face, he realized that the journey was already starting to take a heavy toll. As they discussed how they could raise some money, perhaps by doing small jobs or selling sweets, a middle-aged man passed by the bank and stopped, watching them curiously. He had an intrigued expression, as if he recognized something in both of them. The brothers, noticing his look, became apprehensive. "You guys look tired," the man said in a gentle but firm voice. Julio tried to be polite, simply replying that they were looking for work and a new life in the city. The man listened carefully and then, with a serious look, asked, "Are you Fernando Montero's children?" His father's name sounded like a storm in his brother's ears. How did that man know about his father? Julio didn't react, and Isabella looked at him, confused, waiting for an answer. After a moment of hesitation, Julio nodded. "Yes, we are Fernando's children," he replied, still not understanding what that meant. The man took a deep breath, as if processing a painful memory, and then, with a gleam of sadness in his eyes, he introduced himself. "My name is Alberto. I was a great friend of your father, and there is much you need to know about him and what he left you." Julio and Isabella were in shock. Everything they knew about their father came from the memories he had shared while he was still alive. But now a stranger appeared saying there was more to him, more than they could ever imagine. "But what do you mean?" asked Isabella, with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Alberto asked them to calm down and explained that Fernando, before he passed away, had confided in him some important secrets about his children's future. Julio felt his heart beat faster. Had their father left them something? The man suggested that they talk in a quieter place, away from the noise of the park and the people walking around. He led them to a nearby cafe, where they could sit and listen intently. As they served the brothers a hot drink, Alberto began to tell the story. He revealed that Fernando owned properties and investments that he had kept secret to protect his children from any evil influence, including Lucrecia, who had always known about her husband's possessions, but had never had access to them. Alberto's revelation shocked the brothers, who until that moment believed that their stepmother controlled everything their father had owned. "He always had a plan for you," Alberto explained. "I wanted you to have a chance to start over, to have a dignified life, away from Lucrecia." Those words, mixed with the warmth of the cafe and the cozy atmosphere of the place, brought relief to the tired hearts of Julio and Isabella. They were so close to giving up hope, but now there was a new possibility, something that not even their most optimistic dreams could have imagined. Alberto ended by saying that, with Fernando's support, he had kept all the instructions so that, when the time was right, his friends' children would have access to what was rightfully theirs. Emotion took over the brothers. For the first time since their father's death, they felt that there was a light at the end of the tunnel, a possibility of a new life. While Isabella held Julio's hand, he looked at Alberto with gratitude, knowing that that conversation would completely change the course of their lives. Sitting in the cafe, Alberto began to reveal details about Fernando Montero's past, details that the brothers could never imagine. He told how Fernando and Lucrecia had met and how, from the beginning, he had been suspicious of her intentions. "Your father was always a generous man and trusted people, perhaps too much," said Alberto, looking at Julio and Isabella with tenderness. "He thought Lucrecia could love him and care for you, but I was never convinced of that." The brothers listened in silence, absorbing every word. Although Fernando was a man of few secrets, the matters involving Lucrecia were something he preferred to keep private, mainly to protect his children. Julio, still perplexed, asked why his father hadn't told them about these assets and investments. Alberto explained that, after his marriage to Lucrecia, Fernando began to realize that his new wife had dark interests. She was skilled in manipulation and even influenced some of his decisions, but Fernando, over time, became cautious. He knew that if something happened, she would try to take over everything, Alberto continued. Therefore, Fernando organized all documents and assets so that they were protected until Julio and Isabella were old enough to receive everything. And, with his death, only Alberto had access to this information. Isabella, with teary eyes, could hardly believe that her father had prepared everything to protect them, even though she was aware that Lucrecia was a threat. "So he never trusted her?" asked the girl through tears. Alberto nodded, saying that Fernando deeply regretted realizing Lucrecia's true face, but he never wanted his children to know, so as not to burden them with distrust. He believed that when the time was right, you would be strong enough to face this truth. And he was right, concluded Alberto, looking proudly at his brothers. Julio, feeling a mix of pride and pain, thanked Alberto for taking care of what his father had left for them. But questions still remained in his mind. Why didn't he ever try to separate from her? Why did he allow her to stay with us? Alberto explained that, although he wanted to, Fernando feared reprisals from Lucrecia, as he knew that she could be dangerous if contradicted. She had infiltrated their finances and possessions in such a way that a separation without adequate planning could jeopardize the children's security. He planned to walk away from her at the right time, but illness took him before he could carry out his plans. Alberto then revealed that the documents and goods were stored in a safe in another city, and he was responsible for taking them there. He proposed that the brothers accompany him so that, once they were safe, they could access everything that was rightfully theirs. Julio and Isabella, still absorbing all the information, agreed. Both felt that following Alberto was not just a matter of safety, but a way to reconnect with their father's legacy. Julio, especially, felt more determined than ever to honor his father's memory and protect his sister, now knowing everything Fernando had done for them. The brothers spent the night in the small hotel recommended by Alberto, who guaranteed that, at dawn, they would all go together to the place where Fernando's goods were stored. Before going to sleep, Julio and Isabella talked at length about everything they had just discovered. For both of them, it was as if the memory of their father, who they had missed so much, was alive and present again, guiding them through the legacy he left behind. Isabella, with tears in her eyes, hugged her brother. He was always looking out for us, even after he left, she said, and Julio agreed, feeling that they finally had a real chance to start over. At dawn, with the first rays of sun illuminating the city, the brothers and Alberto prepared to leave. The trip would be long, but the promise of finding what their father had left for them gave the brothers renewed motivation. They felt stronger and safer, knowing they were no longer alone on this journey. Julio was determined to protect Isabella and ensure that Fernando's sacrifice was not in vain. With eyes full of hope, the brothers embarked with Alberto, ready to discover the future that their father had prepared for them. The trip to the city where the safe was located was long and full of expectations. Alberto, always careful, made sure they kept the plan secret. He knew that if Lucrezia found out about the safe and the assets, she could do anything to get hold of them. Along the way, he continued to tell stories about his brother's father, memories that filled them with pride and longing. Fernando had always been a man of principle, and each story told by Alberto revealed the integrity and love that Fernando had for his children. For Julio and Isabella, this trip was more than just a search for material goods. It was a rescue of Fernando's memory. While traveling, Alberto told how he and Fernando met in their youth and how the brother's father always had the dream of providing a dignified life for his children, with security and freedom. He was always a man who put his family first, said Alberto with a sad smile. Each story reinforced the image of Fernando as someone determined, who would sacrifice himself for those he loved. Julio and Isabella listened attentively, immersing themselves in every detail, as if this way they could get even closer to the figure of their father. At one point during the trip, Alberto stopped the car so they could rest and eat something. They sat in a quiet place and took the opportunity to talk about what they would do after recovering the goods. Alberto suggested that they look for a safe place, perhaps even a new city where they could start over. Julio, although still young, knew he needed to prepare himself to take responsibility for Isabella's safety. He was determined to use his father's legacy to ensure they both had a stable life, away from Lucrezia's clutches. During the conversation, Alberto also mentioned the possibility of contacting a trusted lawyer, someone who could help them manage their assets and protect them legally against possible advances from Lucrecia. The idea brought a new perspective to the brothers, who until then had never considered legal issues. Julio agreed, realizing that, to protect what was theirs, he would need to prepare himself and understand how to take care of the assets they would inherit. He was willing to learn whatever was necessary to honor his father's legacy. Arriving in the city where the safe was located brought a mixture of nervousness and hope. They stopped at a small hotel where they would spend the night and, the next day, go to the bank where the documents and goods were stored. Julio and Isabella could barely sleep. Anxiety kept them awake, thinking about what they would find in the safe and how it would change their lives. For them, this was a new phase, a chance to start over, but also a responsibility that they carried with a heart full of respect for their father. The next morning, Alberto took them to the bank, where they had to present a series of documents proving that he had authorization to open the safe in Fernando Montero's name. The process was tense, but finally the manager authorized the opening. When they saw the safe door open, Julio and Isabella felt a wave of emotion. This was not just a metal door, but a passage to a future that their father had carefully planned for them, even though he knew he might not be there to see them grow up. Inside the safe, they found not only documents and financial investments, but also letters and photos of their father, left so that one day the children could have a personal memory of him. Julio took one of the letters with trembling hands, and when he read it, his heart sank. In the letter, Fernando expressed all the love and pride he felt for his children, asking them to always take care of each other and never stop fighting for their dreams. With tears in their eyes, Julio and Isabella felt their father's presence closer than ever. After a few hours organizing everything, Alberto explained how they could access and use the investments responsibly. He offered all the help they needed so they could begin this new stage. The brothers, still emotional, thanked Alberto for everything he had done. They knew that, without him, their father's dream of guaranteeing them a dignified future would never have been realized. Julio looked at Isabella, knowing that, from that moment on, their lives would change forever. With the documents and assets now in their custody, Julio and Isabella felt that the weight of responsibility finally fell on them. Although they were still young, the two knew that they would need to act with maturity and caution to manage everything their father had left. Alberto, realizing how seriously the brothers took this new phase, reiterated that he was available to help them with any decision. He offered a list of trusted lawyers and accountants who could guide them and ensure that Fernando's legacy was protected and well managed. For Julio, this was fundamental. He wanted to honor every penny and every effort his father made to protect them. That night, the brothers decided that they would look for a new city to live. Although they felt affection for their hometown and the memories of their father, they knew that Lucrecia, upon finding out about the assets, would not hesitate to pursue them to take what did not belong to her. Julio, reflecting on everything Alberto had told them, understood that starting in a place where no one knew them would be the best way to start over. Isabella agreed, fully trusting her brother's decisions and knowing that he would always do his best to keep them safe. Alberto, upon learning of the brothers' decision, proposed helping them find a modest and discreet house where they could live without attracting attention. He knew that Julio and Isabella would need time to adapt and organize themselves before really settling down. He also suggested that, after settling in, they consider returning to their studies, something Fernando had always valued. Your father wanted you to have a solid education. He believed that this was the path to a secure future, explained Alberto. The brothers agreed, as they felt that their father's wishes were a priority in their new lives. Alberto's farewell was full of emotion. After everything they did together, the brothers felt he was more than just a friend to their father. He was now like a father figure to them. With a firm handshake and words of encouragement, Alberto left them, trusting that Fernando's teachings and heritage would guide them wherever they went. Julio and Isabella felt strengthened by Alberto's friendship and support, aware that, with their father's legacy, they could face any challenge that might arise. Upon moving to the new city, the brothers began to build a life together, with Julio taking the lead and making the necessary decisions to ensure that everything his father left was preserved. He managed the assets with caution, following the guidelines left by Fernando, but also always seeking the advice of professionals that Alberto had recommended. Little by little, their lives gained stability, and the pain of the past was transformed into learning and strength. Isabella, in turn, began to adapt to the new reality. She went back to school and made new friends, something that helped her distract herself from the traumas of the past and think about a more promising future. Julio, seeing his sister's happiness, felt proud of her courage and resilience. With each achievement she achieved, he knew that his father's effort and sacrifice had been worth it. Over time, he also enrolled in courses and improved his knowledge, knowing that a good education would be essential to protect everything they inherited. In the new city, the brothers also found support in new friends and neighbors, who, although they didn't know their stories, realized that they had a maturity and determination unusual for young people their age. This support network was important for Julio and Isabella, who finally felt that they were building a safe home, away from the threats and difficulties they faced in the past. They realized they no longer needed to look back in fear, as they were now in control of their own lives. At the end of that first year, Julio and Isabella, now stronger and with new perspectives, decided to honor Fernando's legacy in a special way. In a small park in the city, they planted a tree in memory of their father, a symbol of everything he represented to them: strength, protection, and unconditional love. There, hand in hand, they promised to never forget Fernando's lessons and sacrifice, and swore that they would remain united, no matter what the future held for them. Over the years, Julio and Isabella prospered. Now young adults, the brothers had managed to turn their father's inheritance into a dignified, stable, and purposeful life. Julio had become an entrepreneur, and with the knowledge acquired over the years, he managed the family's assets wisely. Isabella, in turn, dedicated herself to her studies and entered college, where she studied psychology. Her career choice reflected her desire to help children who, like her and her brother, had experienced trauma and loss. Life was finally on the right track. But then, a shadow from the past returned: Lucrecia. Despite all the time that had passed, Lucrecia never gave up on finding her brothers. When she learned, through acquaintances and news about Julio's new ventures, that he and Isabella were successful and that Fernando had left them a considerable inheritance, the stepmother found herself overcome with the desire to recover what she believed to be bitter and resentful. Lucrecia began to devise a way to get closer to her brothers and, with that, try to regain control over the Montero family's assets. She knew that getting back together directly wouldn't be easy, so she began to devise a cunning plan. The first signs that Lucrecia was nearby came in a subtle way. Julio noticed that some people started asking unusual questions about him and his sister. He also noticed that certain visitors at his work seemed more interested in his personal life than business. At first, he thought it was just paranoia, but Isabella also noticed something strange. One afternoon, as she was leaving college, she saw a woman watching her from afar, with a look that seemed familiar. When he tried to get closer to confirm his suspicions, the woman disappeared into the crowd. Uneasy, Isabella told what happened to Julio, who, although skeptical, began to worry. Lucrecia's return was a nightmare that the brothers believed was buried in the past. After everything they had overcome, her presence represented a real threat, and Julio knew he could not allow his stepmother to try to manipulate Isabella or affect her life in any way. Determined to protect his sister and himself, he sought legal help to ensure that all documents guaranteeing his rights to the estate were up to date and properly protected. Furthermore, Julio warned his close contacts about Lucrecia's possible rapprochement, instructing them not to provide information to anyone about his and Isabella's personal lives. Despite the preventive measures, Lucrecia's return emotionally affected the brothers, especially Isabella, who relived the moments of fear and insecurity that had marked her childhood. The peaceful nights of sleep began to be disturbed by nightmares and memories of the past. Julio, always trying to be the support his sister needed, encouraged her to focus on her studies and remember what they built together. "She can't hurt us now, I say. We are prepared to face her, whatever she plans," he said, trying to calm his sister and himself. However, Lucrezia was cunning. Taking advantage of old contacts, he began to infiltrate the brothers' new lives in a subtle way. She made friends with some people in their social circle, manipulating them to extract information about Julio and Isabella's daily lives and projects. Using this network of contacts, Lucrecia began to get closer in an almost invisible way, causing the tension in the brothers' lives to gradually increase. Every time someone mentioned her name, Julio and Isabella felt the fear of losing everything they had achieved. To overcome the situation, Julio decided that they needed more robust protection. In addition to the lawyers, he hired a private investigator to follow Lucrecia's steps and understand what her real intentions were. This decision was motivated by a growing concern. He feared that Lucrecia was looking for legal loopholes to recover the assets. The investigator's presence gave the brothers a sense of relief, but still, the tension was constant. They didn't know how far Lucrecia would be willing to go to regain control, and they couldn't risk it. Over time, the investigator gathered important information about Lucrecia and the plans she was trying to put into practice. The investigation revealed that she was in a difficult financial situation and that her only motivation was really money. She had lost everything Fernando had left her, wasting money and making bad decisions, and was now desperately trying to regain some control over her brother's fortune. With this information, Julio and Isabella felt more prepared to face what was to come. They knew that the only way to deal with Lucrecia was to confront her with the truth and, if necessary, take her to court. After weeks of tension and preparation, Julio and Isabella, accompanied by their lawyers, decided it was time to face Lucrecia once and for all. They arranged to meet at a neutral office where they could confront her in a controlled environment. Lucrecia accepted the meeting, probably motivated by the hope that she could manipulate her brothers into giving up part of their assets to her. When he arrived at the office, his look was still that of someone who thought he was in control, someone who believed he could intimidate Julio and Isabella, as he had done in the past. However, Lucrecia soon realized that her brothers were no longer the helpless children she had once controlled. Julio, now a determined man, took the lead in the conversation, making it clear that he knew her intentions and that he was prepared to prevent any attempt to access the family's assets. He presented the documents that proved the legality of possession of the assets, all registered and guaranteed by Fernando's will. "You have no right to anything, Lucrecia. My father protected us from this before he left, and we will not let you destroy what he built for us," he declared, in a firm and decisive tone. Isabella, although nervous, also took a stand. She finally had the chance to confront Lucrezia about the years of abuse and neglect they had suffered. "You abandoned us, treated us like prisoners, and tried to destroy everything my father dreamed of for us. But we made it despite everything you did. And nothing you say or do can change that now," he said, with his eyes full of tears, but with a firm voice full of conviction. Lucrecia, for the first time, realized that she had lost control over them and that the brothers were stronger than she had ever imagined. The presence of the lawyers and the private investigator made it clear to Lucrecia that any attempt to claim the assets would be futile. She tried to argue, play the victim, and even apologize for the years of mistreatment, but her efforts were in vain. Julio and Isabella were determined to close that chapter of their lives once and for all. They had built a life based on the honesty, strength, and love that their father had passed on to them, and they would not let Lucrecia manipulate them again. The meeting ended with a firm warning that any future contact attempts would be dealt with legally. Lucrecia, realizing that she was defeated, left the office in silence, her expression falling as she realized that the past no longer belonged to her, and that there was nothing she could do to regain what she had lost. Julio and Isabella, upon seeing her leave, felt a mixture of relief and peace. They knew that Lucrezia's threat had finally been neutralized and that their father's legacy was safe in their hands. With the confrontation over, the brothers experienced a feeling of freedom that they had never felt before. They knew that this woman, who had made them suffer so much, would no longer have power over their lives. As they left the office, Julio held Isabella's hand and said, "We are free, I say. Free to move on and live the way Daddy always wanted." Isabella smiled and felt a weight lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she felt like she could look to the future without fear. The ride home was silent, but full of emotions. The brothers knew they had won one of the most important battles of their lives. Now, the past was finally resolved, and nothing would stop them from moving forward. Julio and Isabella had plans to build a prosperous and happy life, and most importantly, they had each other. The union that had kept them firm during their darkest moments was now the foundation of a new life full of possibilities. After the definitive confrontation with Lucretia, Julio and Isabella felt a new energy in their lives. Now free from any threat from the past, the brothers were finally able to focus on the future with tranquility and gratitude. They decided that they would use part of the assets inherited from their father to help other children and young people in vulnerable situations, an idea that was born from the desire to honor Fernando's sacrifice and help those who, like them, were also facing difficulties. With this mission in mind, Julio and Isabella launched themselves into new projects, motivated by hope and the desire to do good. Julio, with his experience in business, founded an organization dedicated to supporting orphanages and childcare institutions. He wanted to ensure that young people with difficult backgrounds had the opportunity to grow up in nurturing environments and receive the support that he and Isabella did not have. The organization grew quickly, attracting volunteers and investors who also believed in the importance of a safe home for every child. Julio felt fulfilled seeing the positive impact of his initiative and knew that he was fulfilling the dream that his father had for him and Isabella. Isabella, in turn, decided to work directly with children, using her training in psychology to offer emotional and psychological support to those who needed help dealing with their own traumas. She dedicated herself with love and dedication, deeply understanding the pain and insecurity that many children and young people felt. Her work was a way to turn her own scars into something positive, and every smile she managed to get from a child was a reminder that the past didn't define her, but strengthened her. Over time, Julio's foundation and Isabella's work became recognized in the community. The Montero brothers, who were once victims of cruelty and abandonment, were now seen as examples of resilience and generosity. They had turned suffering into strength and their father's legacy into an opportunity for change for many. The recognition and affection they received from the community were important, but what really moved them was the satisfaction of knowing that they were making a difference in the lives of many people. On a quiet afternoon, while walking together through the park where they had planted a tree in honor of their father, Julio and Isabella stopped to reflect on everything they had experienced. Looking at the tree, which was now tall and full of life, they felt a deep connection with Fernando. It was as if he was there, watching them and proud of everything they had achieved. He would be happy to see what we did, don't you think? Asked Isabella with an emotional smile. Julio nodded, holding his sister's hand. Yes, he would be, and we will continue to do that for him. Over time, Julio and Isabella realized that Fernando's true legacy was not just in material possessions, but in the lessons of love, courage, and resilience that he left for them. These lessons, which they now passed on to others, were the true inheritance he entrusted to them. The brothers knew that, regardless of the challenges that would still arise, they would be prepared to face them with the same strength and unity that had brought them there. The Montero brothers' lives continued in peace and with purpose. They built families, shared their stories, and taught their children the values they learned from their father. Fernando, although absent physically, was always present in spirit, guiding them and inspiring them to do good. Over time, Julio and Isabella let go of the painful past and embraced the joy of a full and meaningful future. And so, the cycle of pain and loss turned into a cycle of love and hope. The Montero brothers found true freedom and peace by helping others find their own strength, and the tree planted in their father's honor became a symbol of their journey. Whenever they passed by, they remembered everything they had overcome together and the promise they had made, to never forget what Fernando taught them and never stop honoring his legacy.